Governments rarely collapse in moments of chaos. They collapse when order remains, but belief disappears. For decades, political systems relied on a simple assumption. People would protest, grow tired, and return to their routines. That time favored institutions. That stability would always reassert itself. That assumption is no longer reliable. Across different countries, a connected generation is making a quiet decision. Not to negotiate, not to reform, but to withdraw consent entirely. These movements do not announce themselves with manifestos or leaders. They apply pressure by refusing participation. Some governments fall quickly. Others remain standing, sustained by force, surveillance, and silence. What links these cases is not ideology. It is disbelief. Disbelief that institutions can be fixed. Disbelief that patience still has value. This is not a story about revolution. It is about what happens when legitimacy expires and no replacement is ready. In Nepal, the protests did not begin with revolutionary slogans or ideological manifestos. They began with frustration. For years, young people had watched the same political figures rotate through power, promising reform while delivering stagnation. Corruption scandals became routine. Economic opportunity remained scarce. Digital spaces, one of the few areas where younger generations felt represented, came under increasing scrutiny and restriction. What emerged was not a movement built around a party or a leader, but around rejection. Organized largely through social media, Gen Z protesters bypassed traditional political structures entirely. There were no unions negotiating behind closed doors. No opposition leaders positioning themselves for power. Coordination was horizontal, fast, and difficult to disrupt. Messages spread in hours, not weeks. Demonstrations appeared simultaneously across cities, overwhelming the state's ability to contain them. This lack of centralized leadership was not a weakness. It was the movement's greatest strength. Authorities struggled to respond. Arresting organizers had little effect when there were no clear organizers to arrest. Negotiation failed when there was no single figure empowered to compromise. Each attempt to regain control only exposed how disconnected institutions had become from the population they claimed to represent. As protests intensified, the pressure on Nepal's political system became unsustainable. Public trust collapsed faster than formal authority. Government responses lagged behind events unfolding in real time on the streets and online. Within weeks, the situation reached a breaking point. Political leadership resigned, the government fell. What had started as a youth-driven protest movement culminated in the collapse of executive authority. In Nepal, Gen Z did not wait for elections. They rendered the existing political order untenable. What made this moment especially significant was its clarity. This was not a civil war. It was not a military coup. It was not an armed insurgency. It was a disruption generated by mass participation, digital coordination, and the withdrawal of consent. The system did not fall because protesters seized power. It fell because it lost legitimacy faster than it could adapt. For observers outside the region, Nepal barely registered as a geopolitical shock. But for analysts paying attention, it represented something far more important: proof of concept. It demonstrated that under the right conditions, Gen Z-led movements could do more than express anger. They could dismantle political stability itself. No ideology was imposed. No alternative system was installed. What remained was a vacuum and a warning. Nepal showed that modern states are not as resilient as they appear when a connected generation decides that patience is no longer an option. That legitimacy, once eroded, cannot be restored through force alone. And that digital coordination can move faster than any bureaucratic response. This was not the future of protest. It was the present, and it would not remain isolated for long. What happened in Nepal was not an isolated anomaly. It was an early signal. Thousands of kilometers away in Madagascar, the same dynamic began to unfold, driven by different circumstances, but shaped by the same underlying pressure. In Madagascar, the trigger was not abstract political reform. It was daily survival. For years, young people lived with rolling blackouts, water shortages, rising food prices, and collapsing public services. Electricity failures disrupted schools, hospitals, and businesses. Access to clean water became unreliable. For many families, the cost of living rose faster than any possibility of income. The state remained present in speeches, but absent in function. As conditions worsened, frustration concentrated among the youngest segment of the population, a generation that had grown up connected to the outside world, aware that their reality was not inevitable. Social media became the primary space for coordination, not because of ideology, but because there were no effective institutions left to channel grievance. Protests began locally. They spread rapidly. Demonstrations were not organized around political parties or charismatic leaders. They were spontaneous, decentralized, and emotionally charged. Young protesters demanded electricity, water, dignity, not abstract constitutional change. The government responded slowly, then poorly. Security forces were deployed, but repression failed to restore order. Instead, it highlighted the state's inability to provide basic stability. Each attempt to reassert control exposed how fragile authority had become beneath the surface. What followed was not a traditional revolution. As protests intensified, cracks appeared within the state itself. Parts of the military hesitated. Loyalty weakened. Defending a system that no longer functioned became increasingly difficult to justify. Power did not fall because protesters seized institutions. It fell because institutions stopped working. Political leadership fled or was removed. Authority fragmented. The state entered a phase of rupture rather than transition. In Madagascar, Gen Z did not overthrow the government in a dramatic moment. They applied sustained pressure until the system collapsed under its own weight. This distinction matters. The protests were not about replacing one leader with another. They were about exposing how hollow governance had become when basic services fail, when electricity disappears, when water stops flowing, when survival becomes uncertain. Legitimacy erodes faster than repression can contain. For outside observers, Madagascar seemed unexpected, even obscure, but in reality it followed the same logic visible in Nepal. A young generation withdrew consent. The state failed to adapt. The result was institutional breakdown. What connects these cases is not ideology, culture, or geography. It is structure. A generation facing economic pressure, armed with digital coordination, and unwilling to accept delay as an answer. Governments built on slow processes, centralized authority, and assumptions of patience found themselves overwhelmed. Madagascar demonstrated something crucial. A state does not need to be defeated militarily to lose power. It only needs to lose functionality. And once functionality collapses, authority follows. By this point, a pattern was emerging, one that would soon appear in a far more controlled, far more violent environment. The next case would not end with collapse. It would end with blood. As the pattern of youthful uprising began to reveal itself globally, another country was confronting its own upheaval, one that would not end in collapse, but in blood and silence. In late December of 2025, Iran's streets erupted. What began as protests against economic hardship, inflation, and a collapsing currency quickly transformed into a nationwide movement demanding deeper political change. Demonstrators, many of them young men and women born after the turn of the century, filled city squares from Tehran to Shiraz, pushing beyond grievances about daily life to challenge the very legitimacy of the ruling system. The Iranian government's response was swift and brutal. Security forces, including the Revolutionary Guards and besieged militia, opened fire on crowds. Verified reports from human rights groups and independent investigations described scenes of intense violence. Live ammunition fired into unarmed crowds, bodies accumulating faster than hospitals could process them, and funerals held in secret under threat of reprisal. By mid-January, estimates from multiple human rights organizations placed the death toll in the thousands, a level of violence unseen in Iran in decades. Some reports suggested more than 500 killed just in the initial weeks, with thousands more detained, many without access to legal representation. But lethal force was only part of the government's strategy. As protests spread and awareness of the crackdown grew, Tehran implemented a widespread internet blackout, one of the most comprehensive shutdowns the country had ever seen. Networks that once carried news, images, and communications were cut off almost entirely. Social media platforms, messaging services, and even phone data were throttled or disabled. The goal was clear: isolate the protests from each other and obscure the true extent of the state's brutality. This blackout served two purposes. By disrupting the flow of information, it hindered coordination among demonstrators inside the country. But it also masked the scale of violence from the outside world, making it difficult for journalists and rights groups to document what was happening in real time. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch described the shutdown as a deliberate attempt to hide violations and avoid international scrutiny. Yet even in darkness, routes to the outside world persisted. Satellite internet service known as Starlink, operated by a private company, became one of the few lifelines. Smuggled terminals and NGO-supported receivers allowed some Iranians to bypass state-controlled networks, sending out footage and messages of resistance. In many cases, these channels were the only way images of the crackdown reached global audiences, raw, painful, and difficult to ignore. The regime did not take this lying down. Iran criminalized the possession and use of Starlink gear, deployed jamming technology to disrupt its signals, and conducted operations to seize satellite dishes in neighborhoods. For many users, having access to satellite internet became an act of defiance, one that carried immense personal risk. In the face of silence on the ground and the blackout of official information, these scattered digital transmissions became testimony. They revealed a truth the state sought to conceal: a generation confronting overwhelming force, paying for its descent with blood, and finding new, fragile channels to share its story with the world. What followed in Iran revealed something larger than a single country or a single protest. It exposed how modern power now reacts when legitimacy fails. When violence alone proved insufficient, the state turned to infrastructure. Communication networks were throttled, platforms were blocked, bandwidth was deliberately reduced. Entire regions were pushed offline, not because of technical failure, but by design. The objective was not just to stop coordination. It was to erase visibility. In the digital age, protest survives on exposure. Images travel faster than official statements. Testimony spreads before censorship can respond. Cutting the internet is not merely a security measure. It is an attempt to control reality itself. This tactic was not unique to Iran. Around the world, governments facing unrest have increasingly treated connectivity as a threat. Internet shutdowns have become routine tools of crisis management. Silence is deployed alongside police, darkness alongside force. But something has changed. For the first time, digital control is no longer absolute. Satellite-based alternatives, operated outside state infrastructure, have entered the equation. They are limited, fragile, and difficult to scale. They do not reconnect nations. They do not overturn regimes. Yet their significance lies elsewhere. They demonstrate that information control now has cracks. In Iran, the mere possibility that some voices could bypass national networks altered the state's response. Possession of unauthorized communication tools was criminalized, signals were jammed, raids were conducted to confiscate equipment. The effort to suppress these channels often revealed more anxiety than confidence. This was not about widespread access. It was about precedent. If control of information can no longer be guaranteed, then every future crisis becomes harder to contain. Every protest risks becoming visible. Every act of repression risks documentation. Authoritarian systems have long relied on isolation, on the assumption that borders, both physical and digital, can be sealed. The emergence of independent digital infrastructure challenges that assumption. Not decisively, but enough to matter. What makes this shift dangerous for states is not the technology itself, but the uncertainty it introduces. Power depends on predictability, on knowing where information flows and how fast it moves. Once that certainty erodes, control becomes reactive instead of proactive. The response, across regimes, has been escalation. Harsher laws, broader surveillance, preemptive shutdowns. The cost of maintaining control rises, even as its effectiveness declines. This dynamic reveals a deeper truth. Modern states are increasingly forced to choose between legitimacy and enforcement. When consent weakens, control fills the gap. When control weakens, fear takes its place. The struggle is no longer only fought in streets or institutions. It is fought in networks. Who controls visibility? Who controls narrative? Who decides what is seen and what disappears? What began as localized protests has evolved into a confrontation over information itself. And in that confrontation, no system has yet found a stable equilibrium. The question is no longer whether protests can be silenced. It is how long silence can be maintained and at what cost. What these events reveal is not a series of isolated crises. They reveal a structural shift. Across continents, governments are confronting a generation that does not negotiate the way previous ones did, a generation that does not wait for permission, a generation that does not believe stability is sacred if it no longer serves survival. Nepal collapsed quietly. Madagascar fractured under pressure. Iran held, but only through blood and silence. Different outcomes, same pattern. Power is no longer challenged only by armies or opposition parties. It is challenged by withdrawal, by refusal, by a collective decision that the system has lost its claim to patience. This is what makes the moment dangerous. States are built on assumptions that authority will be recognized, that time works in their favor, that fear eventually restores order. But when legitimacy erodes faster than control can compensate, the equation breaks. Repression becomes visible. Censorship becomes louder than dissent. Silence becomes suspicious. And fear spreads, not among protesters, but within institutions themselves. Every internet shutdown signals weakness. Every blackout admits loss of control. Every act of force confirms that consent is gone. The most unsettling part is that no clear replacement follows. These movements do not arrive with blueprints for new systems. They arrive with pressure, with disruption, with collapse as a possibility, not a threat. That uncertainty terrifies power, because power knows how to fight enemies. It does not know how to fight disbelief. A generation that no longer believes institutions can be fixed is not revolutionary in the classical sense. It does not storm palaces. It does not seize ministries. It waits and then withdraws cooperation altogether. History shows that systems rarely fall at their strongest point. They fall when they appear stable, but are hollow inside. What we are witnessing now is not the end of states. It is the end of assumptions. The assumption that control is permanent, that information can be contained, that legitimacy can be enforced. In this new landscape, the first sign of collapse may not be chaos. it may be silence. Streets that go quiet not because people are afraid, but because they have stopped asking. Networks that disappear not because they failed, but because they were cut deliberately. Governments that remain standing yet govern nothing but fear. This is not a warning from the future. It is a record of the present. And it leaves a question that no state has answered yet. What happens when an entire generation decides that waiting is more dangerous than disruption? Because once that decision is made, control never returns the same way again.